One of the largest and most perplexing struggles or questions that Palestinians have had to face is, where do we house these collections that are in family homes? What does a stateless people, how does a stateless people develop long-lasting, stable institutions? And should it? I don't want to bore you with the kind of details of this conversation, except to say that this has not prevented Palestinians from developing their own museums and institutions. I think of local, very hyper-local museums, for example, Muhammad Ali's Brothers Museum, just adjacent to their destroyed village, Fornire, that collects objects that were retrieved from the rubble of that destroyed village. I'm thinking of, as well, the massive Palestinian museum at razed, as well as the razed Art Museum just down the hill, and as well as diasporic institutions that have shared interests with the host country, like Darat al-Funun or the Shoman Foundation in Jordan. There are also material objects that come to embody memory and recovery. In particular, embroidery. And the history of Palestine can truly be read through a history of embroidery, how it's made, but also the history of how Palestinians organized cooperatives, workers' cooperatives, in order to develop and grow embroidery as a form of capital for refugees, particularly women, but also as part of nation-making and nation-worlding. Finally, and perhaps most vexingly, is the third form, document. Palestinians for 100 years have been called upon themselves, took upon themselves the task of telling the world and making the case for Palestine and for the Palestinian struggle for self-determination for 100 years. Testimonies have been given endlessly for 100 years. These testimonies have been in front of myriads of commissions, of inquiry, in front of international criminal courts, at the United Nations, at various assemblies, at marches, at rallies, and at political movement party delegate conferences and world social forums for decades. Part of the question of documentation has always been I've always had, and I think many Palestinians have, mixed feelings about this work, in part because it feels so fundamentally useless. That there is this feeling that it has taken and continues, and it continues to be, that this documentation feels as if it's falling on deaf ears. It's exhausting. Sometimes it feels like an invasion of one's privacy. Sometimes a kind of, as a colleague of mine has called it, a cynicism sets in relation to one's own ability to give testimony and constantly be forced to testify as to the struggle for self-determination and freedom. And again, this is an old history. In particular, it's a history of war and war-making and the role of photography and documentation. I'm thinking in particular of the Spanish Revolution, the Civil War, where the image was so central to that struggle. But I'm also thinking about the present moment, the archive of the present. And for me, and I would like to propose this to you, that I think the greatest or most creative, most ingenious archive and archivists amongst Palestinians today are the journalists in Gaza. And in particular, those journalists who have taken up alternative forms of media, social media in particular, to report and to bear witness on what has what is happening before them and what is happening to them. These archives, these are not only documents, they are in archive of not just Gaza, but Palestine today. But I also want to say another thing about archives. There is often this idea that archives can bear witness, that they offer testimony, that what is happening now is all of us watching, and in our watching, we are doing something. We are claiming, we are allowing, or we are listening as, depending on the language, it's often very varied, depending on who's speaking, either allowing or listening to the people of Gaza speak. But I don't think that that's all archives are. Again, archives are a toolkit, but they're a toolkit for change, and archives are change. So in this way, I think, what I want to gesture to is that archives can be a toolkit for justice. And it is our duty not only to bear witness, but to think of this material that has been developed by Palestinians over the last 100 years as the toolkit for us to demand for them, and not just on behalf of them, for them and with them, justice. And it is in Gaza that, as in so many other ways, this is being, the more remarkable creativity and engine and ingenuity of archival retrieval will usher in a new read of the present for us as we bear witness to it, but also of the future. Gaza is in Palestine, but Gaza is also Palestine. Thank you.
Thank you both, and Chiara and everyone in the Library Center, Amilcar Cabral, and everyone who's here for being with us and for hosting us. So let me start by saying that as a Palestinian, I have been in no doubt over all my career that being an academic carries a responsibility, a moral, ethical, and political responsibility. And yet, this has never been more cogent and dramatically impelling to me as during these last few weeks. So in this brief talk, I would like to address what it seems to be an unprecedented turn in the ways that limits are imposed to the ways that Palestine, Palestinians, and Israel can or should be discussed and interpreted. So there is a sense in which a sort of epistemic violence supports and sustains this physical erasure of Palestinians in Gaza and elsewhere. Since the 7th of October, we are witnessing growing attempts to criminalize contextualization and historicization. Providing a context or inscribing Gaza in a long-term history of colonialism is increasingly represented by a variety of voices, actually, ranging from those in the Israeli public and political realm to public intellectuals and obviously mainstream media as equivalent to justification for the killing of Israeli civilians or as too core anti-Semitic. So it is particularly urgent, I think, that we recognize the pernicious nature of this discourse, where it comes from and what it does. And I thought that there is no better place to carry out this task than the library named after Amilcar Cabral, honoring one of the most important intellectual and political figures of decolonization practice and theory of the 20th century. So decolonization is the first way I want to underline the importance of framing Palestine in the right way. Palestine is the last bastion of decolonization that for other people ended decades ago. And the current situation is a violent, horrendous chapter in a long and ongoing history of colonialism and decolonization struggle. However, as I said, any attempt to contextualize or analyze or understand facts in a historical or political frame, or even framing Gaza's lived experience as a consequence of its long-term siege and colonial dimension, or even just any echoing of context, like General UN Director Guterres, who said, this did not happen in a vacuum regarding the 7th of October events, is represented as conflictual, as immoral, and Islam as anti-Israeli, or as I said, as anti-Semitic, or censored. Even those who appeal to the need for respect and implementation of international law in general, citing violated resolutions that demanded the end of the 56 years long occupation, or who cite international organization reports on the existence of an apartheid system, or those who criticize double standards in applications and invocation of international law, risk being sanctioned, are accused of being pro-Hamas, or of embracing terrorism, and so on and so forth. Even the most humane and universal of requests, the requests of a ceasefire to save human lives, has been deemed a partial and unacceptable position, something that we know about here really well in Bologna, because we launched a petition for a ceasefire that was heavily stigmatized in the media and by those who didn't sign, many academics, as a provocative position to have. And again, we got our own dose of slurs, accusing us of all kinds of things. And obviously, as we know, in some countries we arrived at the level of prohibiting demonstrations, which obviously have been prohibitions that have been bypassed, and criminalization of the right to demonstrate. And the number of people arrested at demonstrations and sanctioned and suspended in universities is growing by the hour. So from all sides and in different ways, it seems that defending life, if it is a Palestinian life, or providing a context and analytical framework about what Gaza is or Palestine is and what has happened over the past 16 years, has become tantamount to a pro-terrorist, radical, immoral, or even violent position. Let me linger a few moments on the question of morality, as morality has featured frequently in letters and editorials of the last few weeks. There have been multiple calls on morality as the lens that should or must frame our comportment vis-à-vis the brutal killing of Israeli civilians on the 7th of October. We are urged to condemn on mere moral grounds, refraining from contextualization and historicization. In this, a sort of pre-political or apolitical moral ground is called upon, with any mention of context or history, again, the history of suffering of Palestinians, mention of colonialism, being defined as imperiling our ability to be compassionate or moral. However, most of the times, the context upon which this call is premised is the long historical suffering of the Jews and the trauma of the Holocaust that the 7th of October has awakened. Even Biden said, and this was echoed by many European politicians, let alone obviously Israeli politicians and public figures, this attack has brought to the surface, and I'm quoting, the painful memories and scars left by a millennium of anti-Semitism and genocide against Jewish people. And in this moment, we have to be crystal clear. There is no justification for terrorism, no excuse, end of quote. And yet, I'm wondering, what is this if not a clear case of historical and emotional contextualization? In fact, if behind a presumed apolitical and neutral moral ground there seems to be one history and one context only that are deemed evocable and valuable against the histories and context of Palestinian lives, the former are located above history in the realm of morality, the latter are located in the realm of partial and violent subjectivity and ontologized as outside of history. In this operation, the 7th of October becomes an ahistorical fact, and at the same time it becomes a meta-historical fact, and one at the same time. Now, let me just say, what happens when context and history are suspended is that words stop being attached to a sense of a shared meaning, so much that, for instance, an important Italian national news outlet could invert those who siege, the settlers, with those who are under siege, the Palestinians in Gaza or in Al-Khalil, in Hebron. There is no more colonized or colonizer. Notions such as self-determination and freedom can be attached to any practice. Even settlers burning down Palestinians' homes or trees are looking for freedom or self-determination. This I consider a perilous radicalization. This indeed is a radicalization, leading to an extreme relativism. It is quite grotesque, however, but is very real and deeply alarming. So how has this been possible? Israeli President Herzog has declared that there are no innocents in Gaza. Palestinians, all of them, are guilty then. How does that happen? What kind of epistemic violence allows for this presumption? The first way that this is done is by defining Palestinian life as non-life, or life that has no human quality, the human shield. So rejecting the distinction between civilians and combatants is clearly one way of dehumanizing the Palestinian population. On the other hand, the Israeli victims, which include hundreds of soldiers, become, in the rendition, all innocent civilians. Prime Minister Netanyahu framed the current phase of this conflict, of this current situation, as one between, I quote, children of light and the children of darkness, between humanity and the law of the jungle, end of quote. Ofer Haddad, a journalist and TV anchor, wrote, I quote, "The world finally understands who the animals we are dealing with are. This allows the IDF to exact a much heavier price from Gaza, not only from Hamas," end of quote. So by being taken out of a history of colonial violence, and by being ascribed to a place of a sort of trans-historical, unquestionable evil, Palestinians are then ontologized, are then inscribed in a realm that has no subjectivity. But they are also confined to a space of non-humanity. When Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant states in the wake of the October 7th attacks that Palestinians are, quote, human animals, Palestinians are indeed also assigned a space outside of humanity. This form of epistemic violence is not recent, however. It has proliferated over the years, and I want to really underline this because there is a sense in which some of us might think that it's justifiable to have this language or this interpretation or this sort of highly emotional anger vis-a-vis, the loss of lives. However, I really want to point out that this language and this representation has a long durée. And it has proliferated over the years, and in fact it has started in 1948, if not before. But let's just look at the very recent years. Ex-Deputy Defense Minister Rabbi Eli Ben-Dahan referred in 2015 to Palestinians as animals, and right-wing lawmaker Ayelet Shaker equated Palestinians to snakes to be exterminated. Her words bear citation, as they anticipate Gaza's bombing and erasure with really lucid clarity. I quote, "Behind every terrorist stand dozens of men and women without whom we could not engage in terrorism. They are all enemy combatants, and their blood shall be on all their heads." End of quote. Urging the killing of all Palestinian women, men and children, and the destruction of their homes, she continues, I quote, "They should go, as should the physical homes in which they raised the snakes. Otherwise, more little snakes will be raised there. They have to die, and their houses should be demolished so that they cannot bear any more terrorists." End of quote. Back in 2016, Prime Minister Netanyahu suggested to build fences and walls all around Israel to defend it from the wild beasts. 2 days ago, a retired Israeli general, Giora Eiland, on an Israeli main newspaper, could write, because of this long durée, that Gaza is like Nazi Germany, and then state, and again, bear with me for this somewhat long citation. Quote, "We say that Sinwar is so evil that he does not care if all the residents of Gaza die. Such a presentation is not accurate, since who are the poor women of Gaza? They are all the mothers, sisters, or wives of Hamas murderers." And again, the article continues, elucidating the military strategy. There are no civilians. All the infrastructures of society, hospitals, schools, offices, universities are targets and must be eliminated because they are all Hamas supporters. So, as we know, human rights and international humanitarian law are premised on the horror for the loss of human life. But those who are not innocent nor human can or must be killed without any loss for humanity, without horror or condemnation. It has indeed also never been clearer than today that the grievability of Israelis rests on the ungrievability of Palestinians. In fact, the issue of grief has come to global attention almost exclusively as an ethical and moral question in reaction to the loss of Israeli lives. Palestinians who accept to go on TV, and that's why I'm not going, with other reasons too, are asked whether they condemn the loss of Israeli lives as a precondition to speak of their own loss. As academics and as academics working on Palestine, this current situation calls into question our very tasks, and I'm going back to the question of decontextualization and criminalization of historicization. How do we talk and write about a context where violence and erasure are ongoing and have been for years unfolding under our eyes, and where, however, we don't exist? How do we continue even writing the next book in this situation of intense criminalization? I think this is a moment where we are pushed back to a space which we would have not believed to be under such threat. To defend rights we believed would never be so easily jeopardized: the right to think, the right to historicize, the right to contextualize, which are not only essential, but outside of which, as I said, we are seeing words becoming free-floating signifiers, words that lose attachment to any shared sense of reality. But let us not be mistaken, as I said, this dehumanization of Palestinians is not at all a recent phenomenon. From the outset of the settler-colonial project in 1948, Palestinians, as the indigenous people of the land, which is different from a nativist perspective, but maybe we will have time to go into this, have been dehumanized to enable the project of erasing them. If they don't exist, they are not erased. In a manner akin to other settler-colonial projects, which aimed at turning the settlers into the new indigenous. So the elimination of Palestinians has rested on more than just physical displacement, destruction, and a deep and wide ecological alteration of the landscape of Palestine to suit the newly fashioned Israeli identity. Key Israeli figures drew